Engineers were injecting liquid nitrogen beneath the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Their objective was simple yet incredibly ambitious: freeze the soil beneath the tower so they could drill through it and connect the foundation directly to solid bedrock. It was a technique that had proven successful in many sensitive excavation projects around the world. But in the case of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, it backfired spectacularly. Why was the Leaning Tower of Pisa built on a tilt in the first place? What is the real story behind one of history's most famous buildings? And when engineers finally found a way to straighten it completely, why did the Italian government refuse to let them do it? To understand why the Leaning Tower of Pisa leans, we first have to look at the Arno River, which still flows less than a kilometer away from the tower today. Rivers leave behind layers of sand, silt, and soft sediment wherever they flow. But nature played a strange trick here, one that would eventually become the root cause of the tower's problems. Thousands of years ago, the Arno River did not follow its present course. Over countless centuries, it repeatedly changed direction, leaving behind alternating layers of sand, clay, and soft soil wherever it passed. By the year 1173, when construction of the tower was planned, the medieval engineers had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath their proposed construction site had once been part of the river's ancient path. What appeared to be solid ground on the surface was actually resting on unstable, waterlogged clay and soft sediment deep below. The people of Pisa wanted to construct a magnificent bell tower because an equally magnificent cathedral already stood beside the site. During the Middle Ages, church bells were rarely placed inside the church itself. Instead, they were installed in a separate tall tower built alongside the cathedral. The structure that the world now knows as the Leaning Tower of Pisa was originally built as the cathedral's bell tower, or campanile in Italian. Construction officially began in 1173. The builders excavated a circular foundation only 3 meters deep before filling it with stone to create the tower's base. A 3-meter foundation seemed perfectly adequate by medieval standards. But they had no understanding of the dangerous layers of soft soil hidden beneath it. Initially, everything progressed exactly as planned. Using marble and stone, the builders completed the first floor, and by 1178, they had reached the third level. That was when the ground beneath the tower finally revealed its weakness. The soft clay left behind by the ancient Arno River began compressing under the increasing weight of the structure. But it did not compress evenly. One side of the foundation sank more than the other, causing the unfinished tower to begin leaning toward the south. The engineers were still searching for a solution when history intervened. Pisa became involved in military conflicts with neighboring city-states, forcing construction to stop altogether. Ironically, this unexpected interruption may have saved the tower. For nearly 100 years, construction remained suspended. During this long pause, the immense weight of the partially completed structure slowly compressed the soft soil beneath it, allowing much of the ground to settle naturally. Had construction continued without interruption, the additional weight might have caused the tower to collapse long before the Middle Ages had even ended. Almost a century later, in 1272, construction finally resumed under a new team of architects and engineers. By now, the tower had already developed a noticeable lean toward the south. Instead of demolishing the unstable structure and rebuilding it properly, the new architects chose an entirely different approach. They reasoned that if the first 3 stories were already leaning, perhaps they could compensate by constructing the upper floors at a slightly different angle. They made the walls on the lower side of the lean slightly taller, while making those on the opposite side slightly shorter. Their hope was that, from a distance, the tower would appear straight. The builders continued upward, eventually reaching the 7th floor. But as every new level added more weight, the soft soil beneath the foundation compressed even further. Rather than correcting the lean, the tower gradually developed a visible curve. If you examine the Leaning Tower of Pisa closely today, you will notice that it is not simply tilted. The structure actually bends gently along its height, almost like the curve of a banana. That unusual shape is direct evidence of the medieval engineer's attempt to compensate for the growing lean while construction was still underway. Just as work approached completion, another conflict erupted in 1278, forcing construction to stop once again. It would take decades before builders returned for the final stage. Finally, around 1360, nearly 2 centuries after the first foundation stones had been laid, the uppermost bell chamber was completed. Even at this stage, the architects continued using the same corrective technique. The walls on the southern side were deliberately built slightly taller than those on the northern side in an effort to visually reduce the lean. The strongest evidence of this can still be seen today. Inside the bell chamber, the stairways are not symmetrical. One side contains 4 more steps than the other. This clearly shows that the architects already knew the tower was leaning and deliberately shifted the final level closer to the central axis to make the structure appear more balanced. Despite all these efforts, the Leaning Tower of Pisa continued leaning more with every passing generation. Construction finally came to an end in the late 14th century, but the engineering challenge was only just beginning. Over the centuries that followed, the tower would continue sinking slowly into the soft ground, eventually becoming one of the most famous architectural mysteries in the world. Every passing decade added a fraction of a degree to its tilt, but no one truly understood how serious the problem was becoming. The first accurate measurement of the tower's inclination was carried out in 1817. Engineers discovered that it had already reached 4.5 degrees. Although the lean was obvious, it was still considered a fascinating architectural curiosity rather than a structural emergency. At that time, the tower's foundation remained completely buried beneath the ground. Then in 1834, an architect decided to improve the appearance of the monument. His idea was to excavate the ground surrounding the base of the tower and create a circular walkway so visitors could admire the ancient architecture more closely. On paper, it sounded harmless. In reality, it made the situation significantly worse. Removing the surrounding soil disturbed the delicate balance that had existed beneath the foundation for centuries. Almost immediately after the excavation, the tower leaned an additional 0.25 degrees. Another reminder that even the smallest interference with the foundation could have enormous consequences. A century later, another ambitious attempt was made. In 1934, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini looked at the Leaning Tower of Pisa and disliked the fact that one of Italy's most famous monuments appeared imperfect. In his eyes, a national symbol should stand perfectly upright. He ordered engineers to correct the lean. They drilled holes beneath the northern side of the foundation, the side that was slightly higher, and pumped nearly 90 tons of concrete into the ground. The belief was that the extra concrete would strengthen the foundation and push the tower back toward the vertical. Instead, the exact opposite happened. The massive weight of the injected concrete increased the pressure beneath the foundation, causing the softer southern side to sink even further. Rather than reducing the tilt, the intervention accelerated it. The tower's inclination climbed to almost 5 degrees, and over the following years, it continued increasing at an alarming pace. By the 1950s, however, something unexpected had happened. The Leaning Tower of Pisa had become one of Italy's biggest tourist attractions. Visitors traveled from every corner of the world simply to witness a building that appeared to defy gravity. What had once been viewed as a construction defect had transformed into an international icon. People no longer wanted the tower to be perfectly straight. They wanted to see it leaning. For decades, the gradual increase in its tilt remained little more than an engineering concern. Then came 1989. In the nearby Italian city of Pavia, another historic medieval tower suddenly collapsed without warning. If one centuries-old tower could collapse unexpectedly, what about Pisa? For the first time, authorities realized that the Leaning Tower might not simply continue leaning forever. The following year, engineers carried out another detailed survey. The inclination had now reached approximately 5.5 degrees, a level many experts considered dangerously close to structural instability. Italian authorities acted immediately. For the first time in history, the Leaning Tower of Pisa was closed to the public. Even the enormous bells housed in the bell chamber were removed. Although their weight represented only a small percentage of the total structure, engineers wanted to eliminate every unnecessary load acting on the already vulnerable tower. It was one of the most critical moments in the monument's 800-year history. According to engineering calculations, the tower had reached a point where even a relatively small increase in stress could trigger a catastrophic collapse. Italy could not afford to lose one of its greatest historical landmarks. A special international committee of world-renowned engineers, geologists, and structural experts was assembled. Their mission was simple in theory, but extraordinarily difficult in practice: save the Leaning Tower of Pisa without destroying the very feature that had made it famous. The first emergency measure was surprisingly simple. Engineers constructed a massive reinforced concrete ring around the base of the tower, which acted like a giant structural belt, distributing forces more evenly around the foundation. They then placed approximately 600 tons of lead counterweights on the elevated northern side of the tower. For the first time in centuries, something remarkable happened. The lean stopped increasing. In fact, the tower moved back ever so slightly. Its inclination reduced by roughly 0.1 degrees. A small improvement, but an enormously important one, proving the tower could still be controlled. However, everyone understood that this was only a temporary solution. The huge blocks of lead were visually unattractive and could never remain beside one of the world's most famous monuments forever. A permanent solution still had to be found. In 1995, engineers introduced an entirely new idea. They knew that roughly 40 meters beneath the tower lay solid bedrock. If they could somehow anchor the foundation directly to that stable rock using steel cables, the support would function much like the temporary counterweights, but without spoiling the appearance of the monument. But there was one enormous obstacle. The ground beneath the Leaning Tower of Pisa was not ordinary soil. It was saturated with water. Drilling deep enough to reach bedrock meant disturbing that waterlogged earth. Removing or draining the groundwater could cause the soft clay to compress even further, potentially making the tower lean even more. The engineers needed a way to stabilize the soil before drilling. That was when they turned to one of the coldest substances known to science: liquid nitrogen. They believed it could temporarily freeze the ground solid, allowing safe drilling without disturbing the delicate foundation. On paper, it appeared to be the breakthrough they had been searching for. But nature had other plans. By the mid-1990s, the situation had become extremely critical. According to engineering calculations, the Leaning Tower of Pisa was now dangerously close to structural failure. Experts estimated that if the pressure on the foundation increased by only around 7%, the tower could lose its balance completely. Centuries of history now depended on finding one solution that had never been attempted on a structure this famous. The Committee of International Engineers went back to the drawing board. Every proposal was reviewed once again and every failed experiment analyzed. Then an old geotechnical engineering technique came back into discussion. It was known as under-excavation. At first glance, the idea sounded completely unbelievable. Instead of pushing the tower back into position, engineers decided they would remove soil from underneath it. A tower that was already leaning dangerously would now have parts of its supporting soil deliberately taken away. To an ordinary person, that sounds like the fastest way to make the building collapse. But the science behind it was very different. The northern side of the tower had remained slightly higher than the southern side because the southern foundation had sunk deeper into the soft soil centuries earlier. If engineers could carefully remove very small amounts of soil from beneath the higher northern side, gravity itself would slowly rotate the tower back toward the center. In other words, instead of forcing the tower to become straight, they would allow nature to correct its own mistake. The biggest challenge, however, was precision. The drilling angle had to be perfect. If the tunnels were even slightly misplaced, the tower could begin leaning in an entirely different direction. And once that happened, there would be no way to stop it. Nobody wanted to experiment on the real monument. So the engineers first built an exact test model. According to reports, they constructed a cylindrical replica, roughly 7 meters in diameter, that reproduced the soil conditions beneath Pisa. Engineers inserted drilling tubes beneath the foundation at different angles. Sometimes the structure leaned the wrong way. Sometimes it barely moved. Sometimes the soil collapsed much faster than expected. Several early tests failed, but every failed attempt produced valuable data. Gradually, the team discovered the precise drilling angle and the exact quantity of soil that could safely be removed without triggering instability. Only after months of testing did they finally feel confident enough to apply the method to the real Leaning Tower of Pisa. Before any soil was removed, enormous steel cables were wrapped around the tower and connected to massive anchors and temporary counterweights. Their purpose was simple. If anything unexpected happened during excavation, the cables could immediately stabilize the structure. Only then did the real operation begin. Instead of digging large holes, engineers worked with extraordinary patience. They drilled a small guide tunnel beneath one tiny section of the northern foundation, then removed only about 1 cubic meter of soil. Afterwards, everyone waited as sensitive laser instruments continuously measured the tower's movement. Nothing dramatic happened. Then something incredible appeared on the monitors. The tower had moved, not by centimeters, not even by millimeters, but by fractions of a millimeter, and most importantly, it had moved in exactly the right direction. For the first time in centuries, the Leaning Tower of Pisa was slowly correcting itself. The experiment had worked. Encouraged by this success, engineers expanded the operation. According to reports, they eventually drilled 41 carefully positioned guide holes beneath the northern side of the foundation. Piece by piece, soil was removed. Every few days, the movement was measured again, and every adjustment was reviewed before the next one began. There were no shortcuts, no dramatic construction machinery, no explosive engineering, only patience. Every gram of soil mattered. As weeks turned into months, the tower continued rotating back towards safety. Slowly, almost invisibly, the dangerous lean began decreasing. The angle that had once approached nearly 5.5 degrees gradually reduced. By this stage, engineers realized they could technically continue the process. Given enough time, the tower could probably be brought almost perfectly vertical. But another question suddenly emerged. Should they? If the Leaning Tower no longer leaned, would it still be the Leaning Tower of Pisa? That question was no longer about engineering. It had become a question of history, culture, and identity. Italian authorities carefully debated the issue. According to reports, many experts believed that completely straightening the monument would erase the very feature that had made it famous across the world. Millions of visitors traveled to Pisa every year, not because the tower was perfect, but because it wasn't. Its imperfection had become its identity, and its mistake its greatest achievement. Eventually, the decision was made. The tower would not be completely straightened. Instead, engineers would reduce the lean only enough to guarantee long-term stability while preserving its historic appearance. It was a remarkable compromise between science and heritage. The final results exceeded expectations. The dangerous lean of approximately 5.5 degrees was reduced to around 3.97 degrees. That difference may sound small, but structurally it represented decades, perhaps centuries, of additional stability. According to the engineering committee, The intervention removed enough risk to keep the monument safe for many generations, if properly monitored. After almost 10 years of continuous stabilization work, another historic moment finally arrived. On December 15, 2001, the Leaning Tower of Pisa officially reopened to visitors. People once again climbed its famous spiral staircase, but this time they did so on one of the most carefully monitored buildings on Earth. Even after reopening, engineers did not simply walk away. Monitoring systems remained active and regular measurements continued. And one final issue still required attention. Investigations showed that groundwater beneath the northern side remained higher than beneath the southern side. If left uncontrolled, this difference could eventually recreate the same conditions that had caused the original leaning centuries earlier. To solve this problem, engineers introduced another elegant solution. 3 wells were constructed near the northern foundation, collecting excess underground water to help maintain nearly equal moisture levels beneath both sides of the tower. The goal was simple: keep the soil balanced, because if the soil remained stable, the tower would remain stable too. Today, hidden beneath the thousands of tourist stads taking famous photographs every day, lies an extraordinary network of engineering solutions. A reinforced concrete ring surrounds the base. The soil beneath has been carefully stabilized. Groundwater levels are continuously monitored. Advanced sensors measure movements so small they are almost impossible to imagine. Most visitors never notice any of this. They simply see a beautiful white marble tower leaning gracefully against the Italian sky. But beneath that iconic monument lies one of humanity's greatest engineering rescue stories. A story where centuries-old mistakes were corrected not with brute force, but with patience, mathematics, and an extraordinary understanding of the ground beneath our feet. If you find this information useful and interesting, support us and subscribe to our channel. For more information and analysis, stay tuned to our channel.